Others claim EMPs to be an imminent catastrophe if no action is taken. According to the Electrical Power Research Institute, a high-altitude electromagnetic and of course tons of materials that are still classified. Some compare it to the Y2K scare, therefore calling EMP a nothing burger. Others claim EMPs to be an imminent catastrophe if no action is taken. According to the Electrical Power Research Institute, a high-altitude electromagnetic pulse, or HEMP, would cause prolonged blackouts in multiple states, but not the entire country. Nothing like the apocalypse portrayed in Hollywood movies. That said, the United States has an EMP task force, so it must be serious enough. Here is what we do know. Back on July 9, 1962, the United States detonated a 1.4 megaton nuclear bomb at an altitude of 250 miles over Johnston Atoll. This event is known as Starfish Prime. The resulting EMP from that explosion was much greater than expected, to the extent that Hawaii's electrical grid, which was more than 900 miles away, got damaged. But more importantly, at the time of the explosion, there were 21 satellites in orbit, of which 8 were damaged so badly that it compromised or terminated their missions. What happened to the other 13 satellites still remains classified. A significant EMP attack could be devastating to Starlink and weather satellites, and you can also say goodbye to your GPS. EMP experts like the former CIA Director James Woolsey and ex-member of Congressional EMP Committee Peter Pry argue that an EMP attack not only can cause massive damage, it's also the easiest way to pull off such widespread attacks. According to Pry and Woolsey, if a strong enough nuclear device was detonated 200 miles above the United States, the resulting electromagnetic pulse would destroy most electronics, computers, and cars. And worse, it can severely damage or destroy high-voltage transformers. Knocking down these transformers is like stopping the heart of the power grid. The United States power grid has been called the largest machine in the world, given that it has 11,925 utility-scale electric power plants, about 3,000 utility companies, and over 2 million miles of power lines. In reality, the grid is broken into pieces. The 3 self-contained interconnections of power production and transmission are the Western Interconnect, the Eastern Interconnect, and Texas Interconnect. A big part of the grid is made up of transmission lines that transport electricity over long distances between power plants and cities. To make this transportation more efficient, electricity must be transferred in high voltages, which is done with the help of step-up transformers. Before electricity can be distributed to the customers, the voltage is reduced with step-down transformers. These high-voltage step-up and step-down transformers represent less than 3% of the total transformers in the United States, and yet they carry between 60% to 90% of the nation's electricity. At the moment, the US approximately has 2,100 very large high-voltage transformers rated at 345 kilovolts and above, which service over 200,000 miles of transmission lines. It is exactly these very large high-voltage transformers that are the Achilles heel of the entire grid. With only a handful of transformers like this available as spare, if the grid were to lose too many of them at once, it could result in a catastrophic scenario. The high-end 500 kilovolt transformers cost anywhere between $10 to $20 million and are all custom-made. The global production of these transformers is about 200 units per year. While the United States has 5 facilities that can manufacture very large transformers, the reality is that 82% of them are built overseas. The only countries in the world that produce them for export are Germany and South Korea. Given that the current average age of a high-voltage transformer in the United States is about 40 years, just replacing the aging fleet of transformers would be a challenge of its own. prior to the pandemic, it took about 1 year to order and receive one large transformer. Post-pandemic, it takes 3 years. Beside the price tag and the long lead time to receive these transformers, they are also a pain to transport. Weighing as much as 435 tons, they could include as much as 29,000 gallons of cooling oil. These transformers can only be transferred on specially designed rail cars with 36 axles that can distribute their massive load. There are less than 20 such rail cars in the United States. Alternatively, there are also a handful of specialized trucks that can carry these behemoths. Destroying just 9 of these transformers and disabling one of their American manufacturers would be deemed catastrophic. Imagine what would happen if 100 or 1,000 of these transformers were damaged by an EMP. Both the Russians and Chinese have the capability to produce EMP attacks on the American grid with both nuclear and non-nuclear weapons. Cyber attacks can also be used in conjunction with non-nuclear EMP weapons, which have a lesser geographical reach. Both nations have military doctrines that outline the use of EMP weapons. Combined arms cyber warfare is described in Russian, Chinese, North Korean, and Iranian military doctrines. They call for cyber attacks, sabotage, and nuclear EMP attacks over the United States to black out the country. But even if you believe that it's unlikely for America's adversaries to successfully attack its power grid, there is one more thing that can cripple the grid. Just look up. A coronal mass ejection, or CME, is a large ejection of plasma and magnetic fields from the sun's corona, the outermost layer of the sun's atmosphere. It can eject billions of tons of coronal material that travel at hundreds of kilometers per second. The CME contains radiation and powerful magnetic fields which can have similar effects as a man-made EMP, and they happen more frequently than you might think. On September 1st, 1859, a massive coronal mass ejection occurred, which released the equivalent energy to 10 billion atomic bombs. This event was spotted by amateur astronomer Richard Carrington, who noticed in his telescope 2 patches of intensely bright and white light. 5 minutes later, the fireballs had disappeared, but in mere hours, the effects of those fireballs hit the Earth. Not only was the sky covered in auroras all over the planet, the telegraph communications started to fail everywhere, with sparks flying out of equipment, causing many fires. This event became known as the Carrington event, which is the largest known magnetic storm to ever hit the Earth. In May 1921, there was a similar event that disrupted telegraph and telephone lines around the world. More recently, in March 1989, as a result of CME, a massive electrical power blackout occurred in Quebec, Canada, due to a 9-hour outage of Hydro-Quebec's electricity transmission system. The last major CME occurred in 2012, but luckily it missed the Earth by 9 days. The coronal mass ejections are just like playing dodgeball. It's just a matter of time before you get hit. Solar flares as strong as the Carrington event are estimated to hit our planet every 100 to 150 years. And this is why NASA says that each decade has a 12% chance of being hit by a massive solar flare. But it's not just the EMPs and CMEs that we should worry about. It's also sabotage. Few people may know this, but on April 16, 2013, a group of gunmen opened fire on Metcalfe Transmission Substation in California, severely damaging 17 transformers. According to some U.S. Navy SEALs, the Metcalfe incident was not an amateur job, simply based on the way the attack had been carried out. In fact, both the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the U.S. Navy SEALs concluded that this was likely an exercising dry run for a larger attack on the American power grid. Similar attacks on substations had occurred as recently as December 2022 in North Carolina, Washington State, and Oregon. On a more positive side of this story, some analysts point out that the electrical service was not interrupted in the San Francisco Bay Area due to the Metcalfe incident. Further evidence for the resilience of electrical grids is the Russian attempt to black out Ukraine when they targeted transformers throughout the country. While nearly 50% of the Ukrainian critical energy infrastructure was damaged by Russian missile attacks, and despite recurring blackouts, the Ukrainian power grid ultimately survived. But how likely exactly is it for an EMP attack to happen? Most people view the detonation of a nuclear weapon at high altitude over the United States as an incredibly unlikely scenario, and understandably so. Not only would such an attack result in a retaliatory nuclear strike, it would also be bad for business. Why would China or Russia want to collapse the American economy when it would hurt their own as well? The thing is, the argument about wars being bad for business has been made before. In 1910, Norman Angell published a book called The Great Illusion, with the primary thesis that the economic costs of war was so great that no one could possibly hope to gain by starting a war, the consequences of which would be so disastrous. Even though the Great Illusion may have been correct about great wars being futile, 4 years later, World War I began. The issue with totalitarian regimes is that their leaders have the goal of staying in power, and not necessarily helping their citizens prosper. Their highest priority is total control over the world, and whoever is not their slave is their mortal enemy, and thus war is inevitable. Therefore, blackout tactics such as cyber warfare, EMP, and sabotage are relatively easy, low-risk warfare tactics compared to all-out nuclear war. Some analysts, like Dr. Peter Pry, believed that the why question is the wrong one to ask. The right question is when. In his view, both Moscow and Beijing are willing to do whatever it takes to win. Now, before you rush to the grocery store to stock up on canned food and toilet paper in preparation for the apocalypse, we should mention that the devastating effects of EMPs can be mitigated by hardening the grid. According to the EMP task force, there are relatively inexpensive solutions to shield the high-voltage transformers. The bad news is that according to the task force, the plans to harden electrical infrastructure against EMPs or CMEs are virtually non-existent. A 2019 Electric Power Research Institute report suggests that a large-scale nuclear EMP event will cause regional blackouts, meaning that several states will be affected. They furthermore suggest that the restoration process would be minimal as long as the grid has been hardened, which currently is not. They don't anticipate widespread damage to the transformers. But keep in mind that the Electric Power Research Institute could potentially be biased to downplay the risks. They are, after all, funded by the energy sector, which doesn't want to spend money on hardening the grid. On March 26, 2019, President Donald Trump signed an executive order to harden the grid against EMP shockwaves. Another executive order was issued on May 1, 2020, to direct the Energy Department to prepare for the ban of future procurement of foreign-made grid controls and components that could be infected by concealed malware. However, utility companies are reluctant to upgrade the grid or purchase only US-made equipment due to high costs and their perception that an EMP threat is unlikely. You may run to the grocery store now. Weapon systems have almost always relied on kinetic energy to destroy their targets. From arrows and bullets to electromagnetic railguns that have a muzzle velocity of 9,800 feet per second, military engineers have been designing their weapons to throw one object at very high speeds in order to destroy other objects. However, new and disruptive battlefield technologies like inexpensive drones and hypersonic missiles have shifted the balance and cost-effectiveness of traditional missile defense systems. And this has forced military engineers to investigate an existing, yet misunderstood weapon: lasers. Across air, sea, and land, this futuristic weapon is being developed, tested, and even used operationally. Lasers are being weaponized everywhere, from replacing Israel's Iron Dome system to protecting commercial cargo planes. But why early laser weapon systems failed, and what helped them make a comeback. How this technology could save the military over $100,000 every single time it fires on a target. And how lasers not only can drop drones out of the sky, but they can also keep them flying with the help of fish, is not what you think. One of the primary lessons learned from the war in Ukraine is the rising importance of unmanned weaponized systems. Drones have completely changed the dynamics of war in the air, on land, and at sea. They also cost very little. DJI Mavic, the drone that has reshaped the war in Ukraine, costs around $2,000 apiece. And by attaching explosives to them, these drones have become an inexpensive way to destroy multi-million-dollar tanks. There are, of course, existing ways to counter these pesky drones. Classic anti-air defense systems rely on precision missile strikes. But launching these weapons can be very expensive. For example, the cheapest of these systems is known as manpads. They only need one person to launch and usually use Stinger missiles. However, one Stinger missile costs an average of $100,000. Not to mention the larger systems in areas where Stingers aren't available, like the Patriot missiles, which cost on average a staggering $3 million per unit. So how can militaries fix this price asymmetry to avoid spending $3 million to take down a $2,000 drone? Engineers have spent the past years inventing solutions to this problem, like anti-drone nets and radio frequency drone blasters. But none have been as practical in addition to military's layered defense system as lasers. The main goal of using laser systems is improving a nation's layered or integrated defense strategy. Integrated defense is the use of layered systems of radars, ground and sea-based missile defense systems, and fighter jets, with the main goal of deterring traditional targets. Counter-rocket, artillery, and C-RAM can also address asymmetric aerial attacks. A system with more layers can respond to a higher variety of threats. However, the new low, slow, and small threats like quadcopter drones can poke a hole in a nation's layered defense system. Cost is an important factor in layered defense systems, and lasers are a powerful solution to this problem. For example, a naval C-RAM unit like this one fires 4,500 rounds per minute. It fires multi-purpose tracer high-explosive rounds, each costing around $27. So this burst of 3.43 seconds would cost $6,978. In comparison, that same burst from a 250 kilowatt high-energy laser would cost less than 25 cents. As an added bonus, you never have to reload. Lasers also add effectiveness to a layered defense system. They are more precise, require less logistical support, and reduce risk of collateral damage. But where are weaponized lasers being used today? Laser weapon systems are also known as direct energy weapons. Their first ever use was credited to Archimedes all the way back in 212 BC, when he used mirrors with an adjustable focal point to redirect sunlight onto invading Roman ships and set them on fire. Lasers reappeared during President Reagan's era with the proposal of the Star Wars program. This aimed to use orbiting laser-equipped satellites to intercept Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles. But the technology wasn't ready at the time, and the plan never took off. More recently, the US Congress has identified direct energy weapons as technology that could have a significant impact on US national security in the years to come. The US, as well as a handful of other nations including Germany, France, the UK, Israel, Russia, and China, have been testing these weapon systems for the past decade and are integrating them into their land, sea, and air capabilities. But how have these systems evolved to what we see today? Early versions of laser weapon systems are known as chemical lasers, since they obtained their energy from a chemical reaction. These were some of the most powerful laser systems available, but took up a lot of space. The YAL-1 was one of these systems. Fully operational in 2010, it was a large chemical laser mounted on the nose of a Boeing 747, capable of taking out missiles with its beam. However, the system took up the airplane's entire cargo bay and cost over $2 billion, which is why it was judged impractical and unaffordable and was discontinued in 2011. Some military and even civilian and cargo planes were fitted with similar, less powerful electric lasers called directed infrared countermeasures. This method uses a laser not to directly destroy an incoming missile, but to confuse its guidance system. By pulsing the laser, the missile loses track of its target, leading it off course. This process requires a pod setup, which is usually mounted under the fuselage. A missile warning system detects the missile, directs a turret with an infrared camera, and once the missile is tracked, the laser fires, disrupting the missile. Today, electric lasers have taken center stage thanks to advancements in the technology. These systems are far more compact and scalable compared to chemical lasers. In other words, their power output can go much higher without needing their size to increase, and they are called HEL, high-energy lasers. On land, these systems are being developed by military contractors like Raytheon for protection against short-range aerial threats, like rams, and also new and dangerous LSS targets, like swarms of drones. These systems are modular and can generate up to 50 kilowatts of power, melting polymer plastic drones in seconds. At sea, the Compact Laser Weapon Systems, or CLAWS, has been fitted onto American naval ships since 2014. Their power output is classified, but is estimated to be anywhere from 50 kilowatts to somewhere in the megawatts, and its range far outshines Raytheon's modular HEL. Operating both of these laser systems is incredibly easy to learn, using Xbox-like controllers to aim, lock, and fire at targets. Although they cost over 5 times the price of traditional counter-ram units, the long-term spending on these systems will decrease over time. They may be far more technologically advanced and therefore harder to manufacture, but having much less moving parts and no physical ammunition means much lower logistical costs and much more accurate shots. But lasers aren't only used to kill drones, they're also used to train them, using fish. Fish swim in schools, which are large groups that come together to form a sort of cloud, or you could even call it a swarm. Here, lasers are used to track and stimulate certain fish to see how a change in behavior in some of them leads to a change in behavior in the whole group. Scientists then measure these changes and create AI models based on this behavior to train drone swarms to move more like a group of living animals. This allows them to navigate new or unknown areas using only the movement of the larger group and without needing a full knowledge of the area. The fish basically teach drones how to be more independent. But this research is still in early stages. So how do swarms of drones today know how to navigate autonomously? That answer also lies in lasers, 3D mapping lasers. 3D laser mapping has recently been used to scan entire ships. DARPA is using the same tech to scan large buildings and entire urban environments to train drone swarms to navigate them with the help of machine learning. This program is called Offset. It starts by mapping an area to create a digital version of it. Those 3D LiDAR scanners take up to 1 million photos per second, creating a very precise virtual landscape. Human swarm commanders then use VR headsets to view environments and control simulated drones to set a mission plan. Then, the drones get to work using a mix of AI-driven swarm tactics and human command. The offset system shows advanced swarm behavior inspired by nature, like collective decision-making, adaptive formation flying, and self-healing. Drone operations are limited by how much charge their battery holds. Of course, drones can find their way back to a charging station, where they can recharge and are then brought back to the surface to fly again. But thanks to lasers, drones could soon charge up while underway, without ever having to return to a charging station. Power beaming consists of a laser shining light onto a photovoltaic receiver that is tuned to the wavelengths of lasers. These receivers can achieve 1.5 to 2.5 times greater efficiency when using laser light compared to sunlight. Engineers at the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory have been testing this technology since 2017. This project initially started by delivering energy to submarine drones through optical cables, but soon evolved to open-air power transfers. The system was able to deliver over 400 watts of power indoors to a receiver over 1,000 feet away. Although this may not seem like much, it proved the system to be safe and scalable. And finally, they were able to do an outside test with a receiver that was small and light enough to be placed on a UAV. This method of transferring energy without having to move mass is revolutionary. For example, it would reduce the infrastructure needed when setting up forward operation bases, as traditional wiring and fuel transfer mechanisms would become obsolete. Power beaming is portable, silent, and invisible, and allows for power transfers to areas that are traditionally inaccessible. These elements make it ideal for military operations. But where would all this power come from? The issue is that light travels in a straight line, so this technology's main limitation is line of sight. But what if that was no longer a problem, and we could beam power anywhere on Earth? A new project from the Air Force Research Laboratory, called the Space Solar Power Incremental Demonstration and Research Project, or SPIDER, could do exactly this from orbit. This project aims to use satellites to collect energy from the sun and beam that energy down directly to receivers on Earth. This could further eliminate the need for power infrastructure, making local power generators and fuel convoys obsolete. The cherry on top is that this technology could also be used for civilian infrastructures around the world. But what happens when that beam hits the wrong area? Well, your guess is as good as mine. There is something very ironic about aircraft carriers. You see, their real task is power projection and execution of combat missions. But for the past 100 years, the biggest focus of naval aviation was on its most trivial part, the landing. The backward thing is that it's not the 6-hour combat mission over Iraq or Afghanistan that is the most dangerous. It's when you come back, tired, to land on a flight deck that is constantly moving up and down. In fact, since World War II, a whopping 50% of all naval aviation mishaps occurred during landings. The visual landing systems such as a meatball somewhat improved landing safety, but nowhere near enough. Arguably, the most frequent type of accident is a ramp strike, when an aircraft dips below the optimal 3-degree glide slope and hits the stern of the carrier. This type of accident is 3 times more common at nighttime than during the day. Without a doubt, landing on an aircraft carrier is by far the hardest and most dangerous thing that any pilot had to do. But not anymore, thanks to a software update which revolutionized naval aviation. Prior to the software update, pilots required total silence to have the mental focus to catch the arresting wire. That's why, in order to keep them safe, nobody but the landing signal officer would ever talk to the pilot during landing.
Center ball and hands off. There's a burble, hands off. Hands off. Slight left, hands off.
But now, not only pilots can freely talk to anyone as they land on the carrier, but they can do so with both arms up in the air, without touching any of the controls. Now you might be thinking this is some kind of automatic landing mode, similar to how drones land on a carrier. But it's not. The pilot is still controlling the aircraft. It's just that the software has changed how the airplane flies. But while landing an aircraft is considered an administrative task, how the landing software impacted the performance of new pilots. And what happens if the software malfunctions for a pilot who's not skilled at landing the aircraft manually is not what you think. This video is sponsored by Conflict of Nations. Conflict of Nations is a free online PvP strategy game where you can choose a real country and lead it through World War III. You can use anything from tanks and fighter jets to nuclear submarines to build your military and engage in battles against up to 128 other players. Your neighbors could be your enemy, or you could make alliances. The choice is yours. These are real-time, long-term strategy games that can take weeks to complete. This game is fully cross-platform, so you can play Conflict of Nations with the same account on both PC and mobile devices. And we bring you an exclusive gift. Click on the link in the description to get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. This offer is only available for 30 days, so don't miss out. Landing on an aircraft carrier is like filling out paperwork. Just like any other administrative task, landing is something that naval aviators have to do in order to do what they really want to do. That said, for decades, landing on a carrier was considered the pinnacle of aviation skills, because traditionally, this is how it worked. When approaching the carrier, pilots focus on 3 things: watching their lineup, so they can catch the 3rd or 4th arresting wire; the slope of descent, to make sure that the tailhook catches the arresting wire; and speed. Traditionally, pilots relied on the optical landing system, where the meatball would indicate the relative position of the aircraft with reference to glide slope. If the meatball was above the datum lights, the airplane was approaching too high. If the meatball was below the datum lights, the aircraft was too low. Finally, if the meatball was in line with the row of green lights, the airplane was on target. On a 4-wire arresting system, pilots would aim to catch the 3rd wire, and on a 3-wire arresting system, pilots would aim for the 2nd wire. As you can see, there's a lot of things going on here. In fact, during the final 18 seconds of the flight, pilots on average would make about 300 corrections on the stick and throttle. The reason for such a high number of corrections is that each time a pilot makes an adjustment, they must make counter-adjustments. For example, if they changed the speed, it would affect the lateral position as well as the glide slope, which meant those would have to be adjusted as well. These tiny corrections are called flying on the ball, where everything is done manually. But here's the interesting part. The FA-18 is a fly-by-wire aircraft, which means the controls are digital and the aircraft automatically compensates when necessary. And if an aircraft can automatically compensate for a lot of things while in flight, why not use it during landing as well? In 2015, the US Navy started trialing a software update dubbed the Magic Carpet on the FA-18 Super Hornet and the EA-18G Growler. Note that the Magic Carpet equivalent for the F-35C is called Delta Flight Path Mode, or DFP. The idea was simple: to cut down the pilot's workload during landing on a carrier's flight deck, which would in turn make landings safer and easier. Magic Carpet achieves this goal by essentially automating the counter adjustments that were previously required to be handled by the pilot. Since the FA-18 is fully fly-by-wire, with control surfaces and throttles all commanded by a computer, the Magic Carpet software acts as the intermediary between the pilot and the aircraft. Additionally, the software accounts for and compensates for the effects of wind, as well as the movement of the aircraft carrier. As a result, the landings became significantly easier, safer, and repeatable. All pilots are now nailing the third wire every time. But before Magic Carpet was in use, naval aviators would compete over who could catch the third wire the most. Now it's the opposite. How many times does one miss the third wire? Which implies how bad of a pilot they are. Remember those 300 minor corrections that pilots had to make as they approached to land? Well, with Magic Carpet, the number of adjustments can be reduced to single digits. That's a 97% reduction in a pilot's workload during landing. But how does Magic Carpet exactly work? The pilot manually inputs the speed of the aircraft carrier into the system, and then the Magic Carpet automatically computes the proper 3-degree glide slope for a safe landing. The system calculates the relative movement of the carrier's flight deck, so the aircraft knows exactly where the landing area is. Once the pilot gets on the meatball, the Magic Carpet locks in and maintains the proper trajectory and speed automatically. With regards to counter adjustments, Magic Carpet decouples roll from yaw from pitch, meaning that a single input does not affect the other variables, which means no more counter adjustments are needed. I should mention that Magic Carpet is what the original program was called. It has since been renamed to Precision Landing Mode, and it only works on FA-18s and EA-18s. But let's be honest, Magic Carpet sounds much cooler. But how do new pilots feel about using it? In 2021, something astonishing happened. The US Navy brought their newly winged pilots to aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford to conduct their first landings at sea both during day and night. Landing on a carrier at night for the very first time used to be quite a nerve-wracking experience for any pilot. White knuckles, shaky hands, and tense facial expressions. During the Vietnam War, researchers actually hooked up a bunch of sensors to the aviators and sent them into combat while measuring respiration, heartbeat, sweat, and so on. Researchers found that getting shot at in combat was pretty stressful, but landing on the aircraft carrier at night was even more stressful since it pegged all the readings. But with Magic Carpet, this is no longer the case. Something that used to be incredibly difficult is now actually a little bit of fun. Back to our newly winged pilots on USS Ford, and the results were through the roof. The students demonstrated the best ever performance for day one of training. The pilots wished they could take credit for this performance, but it was the software that made everything so much easier. Test data showed the first-timers made about 20 corrections while flying on the ball with Magic Carpet, with that figure dropping below 10 once the pilots got used to the system. During one of the training days, out of 40 landing attempts, only a few had experienced bolter. That's when the aircraft touches down on the flight deck, but the hook doesn't latch onto any arresting cable, forcing the pilot to fly off and attempt to land again. In addition, only a few of the new pilots had to make adjustments on their glide slope after being called out by the landing signal officers. Usually during qualifications, about 5% of new pilots will be disqualified due to their lane performance or boarding rate, which is the ratio of bolters to successful landings. But with the help of this new system, the disqualification rate may reach 0. In summary, during the 2021 USS Ford qualifications, the new pilots demonstrated remarkable success and a nearly flawless execution, thanks to Magic Carpet. It was also noted that these pilots experienced a clear reduction in stress and anxiety, and a boost in confidence, especially during nighttime operations. But what if Magic Carpet fails? Back in 2015, during early stages of development, the Magic Carpet software was pretty buggy and would sometimes disengage during landing. For this reason, during testing of the Magic Carpet, pilots were allowed to only do so many coupled landings with the help of the software, and the rest had to be done manually, just so that they would maintain their landing proficiency. But as the software evolved, new capabilities were added, which even accounted for various failure modes. What if an engine or flight control surface malfunctioned? What if navigation failed? What if the angle of attack probe failed or a throttle control broke? As it stands, Magic Carpet can handle all of the above and more. In fact, the software has significantly simplified the landing process for FAA teams, even with only one engine working. The latest Magic Carpet software, the PLM version 40, is considered fully redundant, with the goal of making it the default mode of landing on aircraft carriers. During one test run of the Magic Carpet, out of 598 passes, there was only one bolter and 0 hard landings. Whereas when landing aircraft manually, several bolters and a couple of really scary landings would not have been too unusual. The software is so good that during tests, pilots would literally land the aircraft with their hands up in the air without touching any controls. The test results are impressive, to the extent that the leadership actually said that they want the system implemented sooner than later. Now, Magic Carpet is a flight control augmentation system. It's still the pilot who lands the aircraft, and they could make fatal mistakes. But when are we going to see a fully automatic landing technology? Brace yourself, because that technology has existed for over 60 years. As early as 1962, the Automatic Carrier Landing System, or ACLS, was installed on aircraft carriers. ACLS used a radar to guide and automatically land the aircraft. By the mid-1960s, over 5,000 successful automatic landings had been performed. That said, the ACLS was rarely used, since it worked successfully only 60 to 80% of the time, which meant it was actually safer to develop manual landing skills than rely on automation. Rumor has it that pilots who use automatic landing outside of adverse weather conditions received a Scared Kitten Award from the LSO. Currently, the Joint Precision Approach and Landing System, or JPALS, is intended to replace the obsolete ACLS. JPALS is an all-weather landing system that relies on relative GPS signals, which are collected by 5 sensors aboard the carrier and later sent to the aircraft through a one-way data link. This results in a precise 3-dimensional positioning of the aircraft with a resolution of 8 inches. This is the same system that's used to automatically land F-35Cs and MQ-25 drones. All this said, some seasoned naval aviators are concerned that if the new naval aviators only learn to land on aircraft carriers with the help of the Magic Carpet technology, US Navy pilots might eventually lose the skill set needed to manually land on the carrier. Some worry that unexpected electrical issues may jeopardize the operation of the Magic Carpet software, and that pilots wouldn't know how to land the airplane manually. Remember this accident that we showed earlier? The investigation eventually found out that the pilot had forgotten to turn on the Magic Carpet equivalent on the F-35C, the Delta Flight Path mode, even though he thought he had. As a result, he was flying the aircraft in manual mode, which resulted in a less ideal speed during the final approach. The reality is that for Magic Carpet to stop working means that the aircraft systems would be in such bad conditions that pilots would most likely not be able to land manually anyway. Overall, test pilots have provided overwhelmingly positive reviews of Magic Carpet. The only complaint was that the amount of inputs required are so few that it goes against all the years of training and experience that one would have when landing an aircraft manually, and some pilots find that uncomfortable. At the end of the day, Magic Carpet is a win for everyone. It's a win for the pilots, as it makes their job safer and less stressful by shifting their attention from perfecting their landing skills to putting more focus on other combat-related skills. It's also a win for the US Navy, since there's simply too much on the line for something to go wrong while landing a $55 million fighter jet. It's a win for the aircraft itself too, because it would experience less hard landings and less stress on the airframe, contributing to the lifespan of the aircraft. And finally, Magic Carpet is a win for the aircraft carriers, since less bolters means more efficient flight deck operations. Currently, Magic Carpet and JPALS are both operational on all American supercarriers. Play Conflict of Nations absolutely free. This online PvP game lets you choose your own strategy to engage in epic battles and take over the world. Click the link in the description to get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription. This offer is only available for 30 days, so don't miss out.
Today's video is brought to you by Keeps, the brilliant service that helps you keep your hair. Look, I started noticing I was losing my hair in my early 20s, or actually, other people started noticing I was losing my hair. You know, eventually I just caught that weird mirror in the changing room at the store, and you're like, oh, so this is happening. But when this happened to me, Keeps didn't exist. I was just like, well, looks like I'm gonna have to shave my hair and just embrace my inner Bruce Willis without being cool like Bruce Willis. But look, good news for you, hairy young friends. If you do catch that weird look in the mirror and notice you're losing your hair, Keeps are there for you. It's an online subscription service with doctor-recommended hair loss treatments that clinically proven it's no snake oil bullshit that always just ends in tears and baldness. Plus, it's delivered right to your door, so it's super convenient. Also, this stuff is super affordable. It's about half the price of the same thing in the pharmacy. Why would you even go to the pharmacy for this stuff? Keeps is easier and it's cheaper. It's a win-win. Also, this isn't some bam, done, thank you for your business sort of thing. Keeps comes with a year of unlimited messaging with your prescribing doctors, so you can ask any questions that you might have. Hair loss stops with Keeps. To get 50% off your first order, go to keeps.com/megaprojects or click the link in the description below. That's keeps.com/megaprojects. And now today's video. It's the least studied planet in the inner solar system, a mysterious world on the edge of our cosmic neighborhoods that we've almost never visited. From the dawn of the space race right through to today, one constant has been our ability to study the other terrestrial worlds. To date, humanity has sent over 40 craft to Venus and over 50 to Mars. Heck, even Jupiter, which is both decidedly non-rocky and far harder to get to, has seen something in the region of 10 visits by NASA and the ESA. Yet, there's one world which we've constantly overlooked, the runt of the planetary litter, Mercury. Despite being a mere 77 million kilometers away at its closest point, Mercury remains almost woefully unvisited. Our only encounters have been Mariner 10 in 1974 and Messenger from 2011 to 2015. At least, that is, until now. As you watch this, twin craft are currently sailing across the heavens, destined for the first planet. Known collectively as Bepi Colombo, they represent a joint European-Japanese attempt to uncover Mercury's remaining secrets. Yet visiting our inner neighbor is not an easy task. It requires feats of complex engineering and course planning, feats that Megaprojects is going to explore today. So, here's a trick question to get this video rolling. What is the closest planet to Earth? And if you have any space knowledge, you most likely answered with Venus. It's true that the second planet is the one that comes closest to us, peaking a mere 38 million kilometers away. Practically close enough for a cosmic brush of the lips. Yet Venus also spends a good deal of its year much further afield, sometimes right on the other side of the sun. That means the planet that, on average, spends the most time closest to Earth must be the one with the shortest orbit, the one that will reputedly swing by us even as our other neighbors are off on their voyage around the sun. With a year that lasts only 88 days, that planet is, of course, Mercury. Now, we mention this not only because it's a good factoid, but because it also nicely sets up the engineering challenge at the heart of today's episode: how to safely get a craft into orbit around the first planet. Common sense would dictate that visiting one of the closest planets is easier than visiting one of the furthest away. Surely you just point a rocket at Mercury and then kick back and wait for it to get there. But that just shows that common sense doesn't know squat. While it really is easy for a craft to reach Mercury, it's not impossible for it to stop once it does so. The reason for that? The gigantic gravity sink at the center of our solar system that's also known as the Sun. To understand why this is a problem, picture one of those Olympic cycling arenas with the steeply sloped track that's shaped kind of like a bowl. In this metaphor, Mercury is someone like a champion cyclist, Chris Hoy, whizzing around on those tilted sides at high speed. Humanity is the crowd above him in the spectator stands, and the Sun's immense gravity is at the bottom of the bowl, where the slope ends. Now, let's say you wanted to go from the stands at the top and visit Chris Hoy for a chat mid-race. You could technically just point your bike straight down the slope and intercept him, but you're not going to be able to stop if you do that. At best, you'll go zooming past the bottom of the bowl, and at worst, you'll go crashing into him and have to deal with all the angry Chris Hoy fans being mad at you. This metaphor is going very far. In a super simplified way, that's the problem that engineers face with getting a craft to Mercury. You point your rocket straight at Planet 1 and watch it go sailing past and into oblivion. No, if we want to get close to cosmic Chris Hoy, we're going to have to take a roundabout route to get there. One that involves cycling around the track ourselves until we're moving parallel to him. But it is here that our metaphor finally breaks down. Because a probe can utilize something that no earthly cyclist can: gravity assists. Theoretically, it would be possible to fire a forward-facing thruster as a probe approached Mercury, slowing it so much that it could enter the planet's orbit. But counteracting the sun's gravity like that would require unbelievable amounts of energy. In fact, it would require more energy than it would take to send a craft outside of our solar system. That means that scientists need to get creative when trying to explore the sun's closest companion. And it is this wild creativity that in part makes Bepi Colombo, like Messenger before it, so utterly fascinating. Ever since The Martian came out, the concept of gravity assist has been embedded in pop culture. The idea that a craft can use the massive gravity of a planet to speed itself up on its journey is now something even the layest of laymen understands. But The Martian only covered using gravity assists, also known as gravity slingshots, to gain speed. But they can also be used to slow a craft down. It's this sort of gravity assist that's essential for any probe that wants to orbit Mercury. The basic idea is that Bepi Colombo has quite a lot of orbital energy. In other words, it's orbiting the sun at a fairly high speed. To interact with Mercury's weak gravity, it needs to reduce that energy and slow down. By approaching something with a massive gravitational pull, like, say, a planet, in the right direction at the right time, it can exchange some of that orbital energy, reducing its excess velocity. But just doing this once wouldn't be enough. Instead, visiting Mercury requires multiple flybys of planets until enough energy has been robbed from the craft to stop it whizzing off to the bottom of our stellar cycling track. As the European Space Agency, or ESA, one of the two organizations behind Bepi Colombo, puts it, the spacecraft left Earth with a hyperbolic excess velocity of 3.475 kilometers a second. The goal of multiple flybys is to lower the relative velocity to 1.84 kilometers a second. And by the way, the original scientist to realize any craft sent to Mercury would need to utilize gravity assists was the Italian mathematician Giuseppe Colombo, better known by his friends as Bepi. So for those of you who are wondering why the probe is called Bepi Colombo, well, there you go. You're welcome.